Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're looking into socioeconomic disparities that are affecting Black communities,
Yeah.
and this is a global issue.
Yeah, it really is. And, it's something that we have to kind of unpack beyond, those surface level explanations you hear sometimes.
Right, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Exactly. Just work harder, those sorts of things.
And we have a really interesting mix of sources here. Some are very much personal accounts, others are historical analyses.
Yeah,
So
a good mix.
we're going to try to bring this all together for you and see what we can learn.
Yeah, and I think it's important, as we look at these sources, to think about the fact that we can't just explain this away with those individual choices. We need to really look at the historical policies and the systemic things that have really led to the disparities that we see.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me as I was looking at all this is how global this really is. I mean, whether we're talking about the Caribbean, the U.S., Europe, so many predominantly Black communities seem to be facing similar challenges.
Yeah.
Higher poverty rates, lower educational attainment, overrepresentation in the justice system.
Right.
It makes you think like, okay, there's something bigger going on here.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we see in the sources is this tension between what some people argue are internal factors within Black communities and these external forces that are also acting on them. So you see some sources that talk about, lack of support for Black businesses
Yep.
or, a lack of, successful Black individuals reinvesting in their communities.
Right.
But then other sources are really highlighting that legacy of systemic racism and this historical oppression that has created these huge barriers that are really hard to overcome.
So it sounds like it's not about pointing fingers or placing blame, but rather just acknowledging that it's this complex kind of interplay.
Exactly. It's both hand, right?
Wow.
We have to look at how individual actions and these systemic barriers work together. And I think, one really clear example from the U.S. that kind of highlights this is the housing wealth gap
Oh, yeah.
that we saw emerge after World War II.
Okay.
So the country's going through this huge housing boom, right? Everyone's, excited to buy homes. And Black Americans are systematically excluded from homeownership. And as we know, homeownership is a huge driver of wealth creation.
I'd love to kind of dig into this a little bit more. Like, what were the specific things, the policies that led to this exclusion?
So the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, they were engaging in all of these discriminatory lending practices. So they were refusing to give loans to Black home buyers. And it wasn't just individual prejudice. This was very deliberate.
Wow.
The FHA was actually collaborating with developers to make sure that housing was segregated.
So this was like actual government policy.
Absolutely. And they even talk about William Levitt.
Oh, wow.
In the sources, the developer of Levittown, those iconic post-war suburbs.
Yeah.
The FHA worked with him directly to make sure Black families could not buy homes there. So this is systemic, right? This is government-sanctioned discrimination, and it's something that, we still see the consequences of today.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good reminder that history isn't just in the past, right? It really shapes the reality that we're living in right now. And the fact that during that time, home ownership was such a driver of wealth creation, it just makes this even more significant.
Absolutely. White families were benefiting from, as home values appreciated, they were building wealth that they could pass down to their kids. And Black families were just systematically denied that opportunity.
Yeah.
And that contributes directly to the racial wealth gap that we see today.
And it's an example of how a policy that seems, race neutral on its face can actually have these incredibly discriminatory consequences.
Yeah, it's baked in.
The sources also bring up another comparison that I've heard come up a lot in these discussions, and it's the comparison between Black and Asian communities, and this idea of Asian Americans as a model minority.
Yeah, and that's something that we really have to be careful about, attributing one group's success, to then kind of use that to imply that another group is somehow deficient is not only inaccurate, it's actually really harmful.
Right.
And, this whole myth of the model minority that surrounds Asian Americans, it gets used to kind of downplay the struggles that they face,
Right.
including racism and discrimination. And so it's not a fair comparison.
But isn't highlighting economic success a valid way to measure progress for any group?
Well, economic success is definitely one factor, right?
Yeah.
But if we use it as the only measure of progress, we're ignoring the historical context for each community. And there's a quote from one of our sources that really kind of stood out to me. It said, "In a Darwinist world, only the strongest races have the right to survive."
Oh,
And, that kind of thinking completely ignores the impact of things like colonialism, exploitation, and systemic racism, that have directly contributed to the disparities that we're talking about today.
yeah. I mean, that's a pretty disturbingly simplistic and, frankly, pretty offensive way to frame this whole issue.
Mm.
It almost sounds like they're saying that Black communities have to reach a certain level of success before they can expect to be treated equally.
It definitely seems like that's the message. And, it perpetuates all of these harmful stereotypes and reinforces this idea that certain groups are just inherently better than
Yeah.
others. Success isn't one thing, right? Different groups face different obstacles.
Yeah.
And so to just measure progress through this purely economic lens is incredibly narrow-minded.
So how do we move beyond this kind of blame game and start having more productive conversations about solutions?
Yeah.
I mean, clearly pitting groups against each other isn't helping.
You're absolutely right. We need to shift the conversation from blame to understanding, from competition to collaboration. This isn't just a Black problem. This is a societal problem that we all have to work together to address.
So it's not about telling Black communities to fix this on their own. It's about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to try to create a more equitable future.
Exactly. We all have a role to play here.
So what can we do as individuals? What are some steps people can take?
Well, for starters, I think, we have to educate ourselves about the history of systemic racism and how that continues to have an impact today. We can support Black-owned businesses.
Yeah.
Advocate for policies that are going to promote equity and challenge those racist attitudes and behaviors that we see sometimes even in our own circles.
Okay. And what about on a community level? What kind of changes can we make there?
Well, instead of just talking about creating inclusive spaces, communities can take action. They can support organizations that are working on housing inequality or advocate for curriculum changes in their schools to make sure that those curriculums actually reflect, diverse histories.
Okay.
And it's about, making tangible changes that are actually going to create a more just and equitable environment for everyone.
Yeah, and it's inspiring to see communities already taking action, pushing for those changes.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds us that we're not just passive observers.
Yeah.
And we could all do something to make a difference.
Absolutely. And remember, change happens at all levels, right?
Yeah.
Individual, community, but also institutional.
So what about the role of institutions? What can they do?
Institutions like governments, businesses, educational systems, they all have this huge responsibility to really dismantle discriminatory practices and build systems that are truly equitable.
Mm-hmm.
And that means investing in communities that have been historically underserved, making sure everyone has access to things like quality education and healthcare, and promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace.
We hear a lot about diversity and inclusion, but I think sometimes it's hard to know what that actually looks like in practice.
It goes beyond just hiring people from different backgrounds.
Right.
It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued, respected, and empowered to actually contribute their unique perspectives. It's about looking at hiring practices, leadership structures, even just basic office policies to make sure that they're really inclusive and equitable.
Yeah, it's not just about checking boxes.
Exactly. It's about meaningful change. And one of the sources we looked at, a pretty prominent sociologist, actually argues that real inclusion requires a fundamental shift in power. They suggest that institutions need to actively cede power to marginalized communities and allow them to have a real voice in shaping the policies that affect them.
That sounds like a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
Giving up power isn't something that institutions usually do willingly.
It's definitely a challenge, but if we want to get to true equity, it's essential, and it requires a willingness to listen to those who have been excluded and to trust their expertise and their lived experiences.
And speaking of lived experiences,
Yeah.
I think it's so important to highlight the personal stories that we came across in these sources.
Absolutely. Those personal accounts from people who have experienced discrimination, whether it's housing, education, the workplace, they add such a powerful human dimension to these issues.
Yeah.
One person talked about how they were repeatedly passed over for promotions, even though they had, stellar qualifications. And that just shows how these systemic biases can operate in subtle ways, even in places that say they're all about meritocracy.
It's one thing to talk about statistics, and these kind of abstract concepts.
Right.
But when you hear someone's story, firsthand about how these issues have affected their life,
It becomes real.
it becomes so much more real.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to recognize the resilience and the strength within Black communities. I mean,
Absolutely.
despite facing these huge challenges,
Yes.
there's this incredible history of creativity, innovation, and mutual support
Well,
that we can't overlook.
for sure. And several sources actually, they emphasize the importance of celebrating those successes, those stories of triumph over adversity, because they really remind us that change is possible, that there's still hope.
So as we're talking about, solutions, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something that kept coming up in the sources, and it's this tension between relying on external systems for change versus this idea of fostering internal empowerment within Black communities.
That's a really important part of this conversation. So while we absolutely have to address those systemic barriers that are out there,
Yeah.
there's this parallel need for internal empowerment and community building. And that means supporting Black-owned businesses,
Hmm.
investing in education and mentorship programs, and really fostering a sense of collective responsibility.
That reminds me of something one of the sources said, a community leader talking about the importance of Black communities defining their own narratives
Yeah.
and shaping their own destinies.
That's powerful. It's
Yeah.
about reclaiming agency and not waiting for someone else to come along and empower you.
Right.
It's about recognizing the strengths and the assets that exist within the community
Yeah.
and using those to create change.
But doesn't that risk putting too much of the burden on Black communities to fix problems that they didn't create, that were created by systems outside of their control?
That's a really valid concern, and I think it's super important to keep that balance, right?
Hmm.
So while we're working to break down those external barriers, we can also be empowering communities from within.
Right.
It's not about blaming anyone or saying it's their responsibility to fix this. It's about recognizing the power of self-determination and collective action.
So it's not either.
No, it's both, and we need both.
And this makes me think about the challenges that a lot of Black entrepreneurs face.
Yeah.
They often struggle to get access to capital and resources, even when they have these incredible business ideas.
Absolutely. And we saw that come up a lot in the sources. There's this one study that found that Black-owned businesses are way less likely to get bank loans than other businesses,
Wow.
even when you account for things like creditworthiness and business experience. And this lack of access to capital, it has this ripple effect,
Yep.
right? It limits how much those Black businesses can grow.
Mhm.
It hurts their potential.
Right.
And it ends up hindering economic empowerment for the whole community.
So it sounds like access to capital is this major hurdle for Black entrepreneurs.
It is.
Are there organizations or initiatives out there that are trying to address this?
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of the sources pointed to groups like the Black Business Investment Fund,
Well,
the National Black Chamber of Commerce.
mhm.
And these organizations, they provide financial help, mentorship, networking opportunities to Black entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
And we're also seeing a growing movement in venture capital to invest specifically in Black-founded startups,
Oh, well.
because they're recognizing that there's all this untapped potential and there's a need for more representation in the tech industry.
It's great to see that gaining some traction.
Yeah.
It sounds like more people are realizing that, supporting Black businesses isn't just about social justice. It's also smart business.
Right. Investing in those businesses and in those entrepreneurs benefits everybody. It creates jobs, stimulates economic growth, and it leads to more innovation.
As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the importance of Black communities, being able to define their own narratives.
Mhm.
What are some ways that we can help make sure that those voices are heard?
That's such a great question. And I think it starts with us actively seeking out those voices and perspectives,
Mhm.
whether it's through, books, movies, music, or just engaging with our communities.
Yeah.
It's about making space for those voices to be heard and
Mhm.
challenging those dominant narratives that so often exclude or misrepresent Black experiences.
One of our sources, journalists, was talking about the role of the media and how important it is in shaping public perception. And they were suggesting that, news outlets really need to do a better job of covering stories that showed the diversity of Black experiences
Mm-hmm.
instead of just focusing on negative stereotypes or, those sensationalized narratives.
I completely agree. It's about moving beyond those limited and often distorted portrayals that we see in the mainstream media and allowing Black communities to tell their own stories in their own words.
I think that's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking a lot about the historical and systemic factors,
Mm-hmm.
that have contributed to the disparities that we see today.
Right.
But I think it's equally important to recognize, the agency and the resilience within Black communities.
Absolutely.
One of the sources is the historian said something that really stuck with me. They said, Black history is not just a story of oppression. It's also a story of incredible strength, creativity, and resistance.
That's so true.
And it's about recognizing that even in the face of incredible challenges,
Yeah.
Black communities have always found ways to thrive and innovate.
Yeah.
I think that's a powerful note to end on. The challenges are real, the history is complex, but the potential for change is immense.
I agree. This deep dive has been a reminder that we all have this responsibility to create a more just and equitable world,
Absolutely.
one where everybody has the opportunity to thrive and reach their full potential.
Thanks for joining us on this journey,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.